with what's going on in Europe today, do you think that they're getting to the point that the situation in Ukraine is somehow unsustainable for them? Or you see somehow they want to continue the war as, as long as possible, hoping that in the aftermath of, the Trump administration, someone comes in power in Washington and they can, continue with the same old policy in Ukraine?
Well, they're probably counting on that. But you see, and we have discussed that on your program a few months ago when the French chief of staff was threatening, or not threatening, but raising the issue of the Russian threat within a couple of years. Russia would be attacking France and would target France and all that. And now you have Tulsi Gabbard, who just said that this is only lies and propaganda, and the Russia has no willingness whatsoever to attack Europe. It has not even the means to attack Europe, and has something that I have said on your program, by the way, that even if Russia wanted to attack Europe, it would probably not have the necessary resource to occupy Europe, because if you reach Paris, it's fine to attack, probably, but then you have to occupy the territory, and you understand that that
Colonel, you look at the size of the country, the
exactly.
population, it's impossible.
This is exactly that. I mean, this is why these kind of assessments that were made by the French foreign minister, by the French chief of staff, but also by others like in the UK, in Germany, and all that. All these assessments are simply lies and propaganda, as Tulsi Gabbard said. And now you have people changing their mind. You have seen the Finnish president saying that Russia is no threat. Now you have the head of the Estonian intelligence service saying that Russia has no willingness to attack the Baltic states. So we have seen a lot of people backpedaling on this issue. But all that it illustrates exactly what I said before, that Europe has in fact the problem of an irrational decision making, because you cannot say Russia will attack us and we have to rearm and we have to build that and to double the defense budget and all that, and just weeks after that saying, well, no, it was all bullshit and all that. You cannot say that. That means that the assessment in the first instance was extremely poor, and that shows exactly the quality of the decision making we have in Europe, you see. And this is, I think, the major threat of the Europe now is not so much Russia, China, Iran, or whoever. The problem that we have in Europe is poor leadership. This is the major problem we have. People who are not able to assess the issues as they are. They base their assessment on their own perception of the issues, not on what the issues are really. And that's something that I have already mentioned in all my books, in fact, since the very beginning. They convinced themselves that Russia is weak, and now it appears that it's strong. So the idea, and the French Minister of Economy on the 1st of March 2022 said that the objective of the Europeans was to have Russia to collapse, and that it would collapse within weeks. That was the 1st of March 2022. And now you see that although the growth in Russia has slowed a little bit, but nevertheless, Russia will still have a better GDP growth than the European countries. Not much better, but still better. So we are exactly on the opposite side of what Europeans were saying before. They were telling us for the last 4 years that the Russia has had no tanks, had no missiles anymore. They had only missiles just for the next month, and that would be at the end of it. They were saying that the Russian soldiers were unable and they were defecting and all that. And we see that it's exactly the opposite that happens. Even Ukrainian leadership, I mean the military leadership, acknowledged that the Russians are not as weak as the Europeans said. So we see that all the decision making, and that's the danger. As I always said, I don't mind if anyone on the street or people you know your friends or anyone thinks that the Russians are weak. Uh, I'm not I'm not Russian. I don't really care what people. The problem is when the decision maker starts to base its decision on this kind of fantasy. Because when you make a decision which obviously has long terms or mid terms effect,
Yeah.
you need to have the proper assessment. You cannot base your judgment just on wishful thinking. And what we have seen in the past 4 years is in Europe simply wishful thinking. And of course, here you ask the question about Ukraine, but in reality, we see the whole exact same thing when you address Syria, Palestine, Iran. We have exactly the same thing. People don't base their judgment or their assessment on the reality of facts, but they base it on their own perception of things. And the what the French chief of staff was saying publicly illustrates exactly that because he made very precise description of what may happen within the next 4 years or so. And apparently, if you listen to the US intelligence, which is probably not so in favor of Russia, but probably more professional, they say exactly the opposite. So we are. That's exactly the problem we have, and uh, uh, I I don't find the words to describe this. This is just a scandal that you may have people we pay for making decision, we pay to make assessment of the situation, and instead of making professional assessments to make decisions based on the real facts, they interpret the facts in order to adjust. They make the judgment and then they adjust the fact to the judgment instead of making the judgment based on facts. And that's where it cannot move ahead. And that's by the way, we talk
This is
mostly
exactly what's going on with your case, by the way.
exactly, yes, exactly, yes, that's exactly that. Is exactly that. And but you can address all the issue of economy, and the EU was asking asking the India or and China to stop buying uh, um, oil products from Russia. But at the same time, in the last 4 years, one of the main customer of liquefied natural gas, LNG, is still the European Union. So the European Union is asking other countries to stop buying Russian products while themselves they were buying Russian products. You see, we are completely, this is this kind of
At a
complete,
much higher price, by the way,
uh,
currently.
at much, no, I don't know exactly at which price they buy the LNG from Russia, but certainly the price they pay from the US is much higher. The thing is that instead of being consistent with a strategy to say, okay, we want to isolate Russia, so we stopped right away We don't buy anything, but they realize that they still need something. So they they ask the others to stop, but for them they can wait a little bit. You see, and that's where we see the whole problem. This is inconsistency of the issue. And but the fact that the EU is still buying some oil products from Russia is, of course, something which is not advertised publicly. We know it because if you look at the stats and the figures and all that, we understand that is still the case. But of course, the EU is not advertising that. But they are much more keen to ask India to stop buying oil, and the same, of course, to China. So we see this kind of inconsistency that appears in the whole narrative that is circulating now in Europe on a lot of matters. Nobody questioned the issue of cheap energy, and of course, people raise the issue that we are dependent. We depend on Russia for energy, for gas and things like this. In reality, Europe doesn't depend on Russia. Europe depends on energy. Europe has not the ability to have its own energy sources, and therefore it depends, whoever it is. And we see now that buying in the US is much more expensive than buying to Russia. The taxpayer pays the difference, but it is a failed policy just for the sake of saying that we don't want to depend on Russia, even though we depend on Russia for gas since the 1980s. And even during the Cold War, Russia has never stopped delivering gas to Europe. They never put any condition for that. You had a contract, and the Russians respected the contract. Period. They never came and say, well, if you, because obviously during the Cold War, you had some export restrictions. For instance, when you had in the 80s computers, personal computers being developed in the West, especially in the US, of course, all these computers and this technology was embargoed and could not reach the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union never tried to bargain the gas trade with other kind of trades. They never did that. So they never said, "Well, if you don't provide us with computer, we stop providing gas." They never said so. So the Russians kept strictly what was on the contracts. Therefore, we have already an experience in the past 50, more than 50 years in reality, that the Russians stick to what they have signed. So the whole issue of no longer being dependent on Russia is just something. It is something that just came out of the mind of people like Ursula von der Leyen and others. Period. This is just a perception of things, but it's not sustained by any fact. And again, we have an additional example of this leadership that has started kind of 4 or 5 years ago in Europe, has become extremely, extremely um, emotional in its substance and not factual in any way. And that's exactly where we are when we talk about the conflict in Ukraine. The Americans have realized that, and they have realized that, and I mean November, since November 2022, they have realized that there is no way that Ukraine can win this war. Therefore, they advised already in November 2022 Zelensky to start open the door for negotiation with the Russians. So the Americans have realized this 4 years ago or 3 years ago. Uh, But the Europeans didn't. They resisted to that. And even now, we have those negotiations. And of course, Zelensky is extremely happy because he has negotiated with Europeans, and everybody's happy with this internal discussion. And now he has discussed with the US, and apparently he's happy with the discussion. But they haven't addressed the Russians yet. And the Russians are precisely those who are key in the discussion. You can be very happy within your own family, but the issue is, will the Russians accept that? And that's exactly where we are. Again, we are happy with what we have decided something. We want a ceasefire. We want a DMZ. We want this and that and that. But they never questioned whether the Russians will accept this or not. And they still live in the fantasy that the Russians are weak and they cannot do anything else than just accepting the Ukrainian conditions. So again, despite the effort of the US to try to negotiate a solution, the Europeans still stick to a perception of things and not on the reality of things. And that, I think, is exactly the weakness. And again, it applies to everything. And that's the reason why we have all these problems. And that's also why, in fact, despite all the narrative that NATO or EU will come out strengthened by the conflict in Ukraine, it's not the case. We see the split between the US and the rest of NATO, and the US is basically the cornerstone of NATO, because all the NATO is organized around the US nuclear umbrella, meaning that if you have a split between the Europeans allies and the US, the whole NATO crumbles. There's no NATO anymore. Um, the same with EU. We see now that we have witnessed the whole issue of the Russian assets, and we see that a lot of people within the EU are understanding the nature of the problem and understand that seizing the Russian assets is illegal. That's exactly the point of the Belgian Prime Minister and others who have said, well, that's illegal. And now you have a split between the within the European Union. And even the European Union, in order to continue to sustain Ukraine, instead of finding a good agreement, they now the European Union has to get a loan to provide those 90 billion to the Ukraine, meaning that Europe is worsening its situation. Ukraine is worsening its situation. Had the Europeans accepted uh, the proposal, I mean, accepted, they had not prevented Zelensky to make his proposal in the early 2022, the situation of Ukraine would be much better. So Europe has put itself into kind of a trap somehow, because now they cannot withdraw from the for what they promised to Ukraine, and therefore now it's Europe that indebt himself in order to pay something that we know will fail, because what we see the situation on the ground is not in favor of Ukraine. In fact, it's in favor of Russia, even if Russia doesn't move fast enough, as some would say. But again, the objective of the Russians has never been to gain territory. And that's exactly, by the way, what Tulsi Gabbard said. This is not the objective of the Russians to take Ukraine. Again, the objective of the Russians were to demilitarize. Now, you can demilitarize by treaty, by saying, okay, instead of having so many 100,000 people, you will have just 100,000 or less. I think in April 2022, they agreed on a Ukrainian army of 80,000 or something like that. Any case, uh, the demilitarization can occur on that way, but since the Europeans prevented to have, let's say, an agreement on the demilitarization, well, the Russians have said, okay, you don't want the agreement, so we demilitarized by force, and that's exactly what's happening. But it's a don't make no mistake. What the Russians are doing is to demilitarize Ukraine by force, nothing else. It's not to gain territory, it's simply to demilitarize Ukraine. And again, because the Europeans were convinced and convinced themselves, in fact, that the aim of the Russians was to take territory, they they tried to convince Zelensky that he should defend every single square inch of Ukraine. As a result, a lot of people are dying for defending piece of ground that the Russians will take anyway. As a result, the Ukraine has in fact wasted human resources, its human potential, and that will, of course, weigh into the economy because ultimately people cannot be military all the time. A lot of those soldiers who die used to be workers, engineers, or uh, teachers, or whoever. So these were people who make the economy run, actually. So what the Russians are doing by demilitarizing Ukraine is in fact not just to destroy a military potential, but they destroy a potential, period. And all that could have been prevented had the Europeans understood what were the real objectives of the Russians in 2022. But no, they didn't want to listen to the Russians. They convinced themselves that the objective of the Russians was to take over Ukraine. And that's certainly not what the Russians will do.